What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Angry Ginger Podcast. First things first, I owe you all an apology. I've been a little inconsistent getting episodes out lately. And honestly, I have nobody to blame but myself. Apparently, I had that brilliant idea to start this podcast around the same time that I decided I'm starting to move. So yeah, really great planning on my part. Nothing says I'm going to launch a consistent podcast like packing up your house, trying to figure out where you're going to live, moving a million things, dealing with everything that comes with leaving home, especially one that you've been in for years, and then sitting down and thinking, I should probably record a podcast tonight. So I'm working on that. The move has been taking up a hell of a lot more time and energy than I expected, but I didn't want to just disappear on you guys. So thank you to everybody who's stuck around, listening to the episodes, shared them, followed the show, especially those of you who've been asking, when the hell is the next episode? Well, here it is. And I figure after everything else we've talked about lately, dating, cybersecurity, life, bad decisions, and me apparently having the world's worst dating resume, it was time to go back to something a little bit more comfortable. Something that, honestly, I could probably talk about for hours. The 90s. We talked about the 90s back in episode 3, but I realized something after that episode. We barely scratched the surface, because the 90s weren't just a decade of great music, movies, television, and questionable fashion choices. They were the last decade before the internet completely took over our lives. Think about that. We grew up in a world where you could leave the house. Nobody could reach you. You didn't have a cell phone. You didn't have Facebook or Instagram or TikTok. There wasn't a camera in your pocket recording every stupid thing you did, and somehow we survived. We actually had to make plans with people. If you wanted to know where your friends were, you actually had to call them. And if their parents answered the phone, well, you better have a damn good excuse for why you were calling. We watched television when the television told us what was on. We went to Blockbuster to rent movies. We went to the mall just to walk around. We listened to the radio hoping they'd play our favorite song. We bought CDs with our own money, and then discovered 3 songs into the album that maybe we should have listened to the whole thing before spending $15. We played video games that required blowing into cartridges, which, by the way, I'm sure accomplished absolutely nothing. And, we also thought that gigantic pants were fashionable, which, yeah, they are. Jinko jeans, of course. But here's the thing. When I look back at being a teenager in the 90s, I don't remember all the technology we didn't have. I remember the experiences that we did have. And I think that's what made the decade so special. So tonight, we're going to go a little deeper. We're going to go back into the music, the movies, the television, the video games, the malls, the fashion, the early internet, and all those weird little things that made growing up in the 90s feel like growing up in a completely different world, because it was. And maybe, just maybe, the 90s weren't actually perfect. Maybe we just didn't have social media around to document all the stupid shit we were doing. So grab a drink, turn up the volume, let's take another trip back in time to when life was a little slower, the phones were attached to the wall, and getting kicked off the internet because somebody needed to make a phone call was a legitimate household crisis. This is the Angry Ginger Podcast, and we're going back to the 90s. Now, before we get into today's episode, I want to address something from last week. Apparently, I ruffled some feathers. And not just random feathers. Apparently, some of the people I was talking about realized I was talking about them. And to be completely honest, I'm not losing any sleep over it. Now, if you heard last week's episode and recognized yourself in one of those stories, there's probably a reason for that. I didn't make any of those experiences up. I didn't invent what happened. I talked about things that actually happened in my life and how those experiences affected me. And here's the thing. If you hear yourself being described in somebody else's story and your first reaction is, how dare they talk about me like that? Maybe take a second before getting angry and ask yourself, why did that story hit so close to home? Because I'm not responsible for making somebody look good in a story about something that they actually did. I'm responsible for telling my side of the experience, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has to agree with me. You're absolutely entitled to your own version of events. Maybe you remember things differently, and that's fine. But I'm also entitled to tell people what happened from where I was standing. And if something I said made you uncomfortable, maybe that's worth sitting with. Because sometimes the thing that pisses us off the most are the things that hit a little too close to the truth. So no, I'm not losing sleep over what I said. I'm not sitting at home wondering who's mad at me. I'm not going to retract my experiences because somebody didn't like hearing them. And I'm definitely not going to spend my time trying to convince somebody that they were wrong. Look inward. If you don't like the way you came across in my story, ask yourself why. Maybe the problem isn't that I told the story. Maybe the problem is what happened in the story. And with that, we're moving on. Because this is the Angry Ginger podcast, I'm going to tell my stories. I'm going to give my opinions. Sometimes you're going to agree with me. Sometimes you're going to think I'm a completely full of shit. And occasionally, I'm probably going to piss somebody off. That's part of the deal. So if you're still here after last week's episode, I appreciate the hell out of you. And if you're one of the people that got pissed off, well, you know where the unfollow button is. I'm still here. Now, let's talk about something a little less controversial. Let's get into the 90s again, because apparently I need to give everybody a week to recover before I piss them off again. So let's go back. All right, now let's talk about television. And I don't mean television like we have it today. I'm talking about when watching a TV show was actually an event. Because if you grew up in the 90s, you remember this. You didn't just open an app and scroll through 15,000 shows trying to figure out what you wanted to watch. You had the TV Guide, that little book that was basically a 90s version of some kind of Netflix guide. You'd flip through it, find out what was on, and then you'd make plans around it. Because if your favorite show came on at 8 o'clock, you'd better be sitting in front of that television at 8 o'clock. At that time, there was no DVR. There was no streaming. There wasn't even a record from anywhere button. If you missed an episode, you missed it, and you had to wait for reruns. That's it. You didn't Google what happened. You didn't find a recap on Reddit. You didn't watch it on YouTube. You just walked into school the next day and asked your friends, what happened last night? And hopefully nobody spoiled the entire damn thing before you got home. And there was something special about that. Everybody was watching the same things. You could walk into school on Monday and almost guarantee that somebody was talking about whatever happened on television the night before. And the 90s had some absolutely incredible television. I mean, listen to this. You had The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Family Matters, Step by Step, Full House, Boy Meets World, Home Improvement, Seinfeld, Friends, The Simpsons. And then you had the shows that your parents probably didn't want you watching, which of course made you want to watch them even more. You know, Beavis and Butthead, South Park started back then. Those shows were basically teenage forbidden fruit. And let's be honest, half the fun was knowing you probably shouldn't be watching them. Then there was MTV, and I'm talking about real MTV, back when MTV actually played music. You turned it on and watched music videos, not reality shows, not whatever the hell MTV eventually turned into, music videos. And if your favorite artist had a new video coming out, you watched. And if they announced a new video was going to premiere at 7, you were there at 6:55 because there was no YouTube. You couldn't just search it up whenever you wanted. You had to wait. And waiting made things exciting. That's something I think we've lost. Everything is available instantly now. And because everything is available instantly, nothing really feels like an event anymore. Back then, if your favorite show was coming on, you knew exactly what time it started. You knew the opening theme. You knew the commercials. You knew the characters. You talked about it with your friends the next day. And speaking of characters, let's talk about something every teenager had in the 90s, a celebrity crush. Come on, don't sit there acting like you didn't. Everybody had one. Maybe it was a singer. Maybe it was an actress. Maybe it was some movie star. But everybody had that one person that they thought was absolutely perfect. And for me, there was no question. Topanga Lawrence from Boy Meets World. Absolutely. I mean, come on. I was a teenage guy in the 90s. There she was, smart, funny, beautiful. And she somehow managed to make a hippie-ish name like Topanga sound completely normal. I was watching Boy Meets World thinking, yeah, that's the one. Of course, in reality, if Topanga had actually met teenage me, she'd probably have taken one look and said, yeah, no. But that's the beauty of a celebrity crush. You don't have to actually have a chance. You just sit there on your couch thinking, one day. Meanwhile, Topanga is fictional, so probably not going to happen. And Boy Meets World was one of those shows that really captured being a teenager. You watched Corey, Sean, and Topanga grow up. And as you got older, the show grew up with you. And I think that's one of the reasons 90s television sticks with people. We didn't just watch these characters, we grew up alongside them. And there was another thing that made television different back then, the commercials. Now, I know that sounds crazy. Nobody really misses commercials, but there were commercials in the 90s that were practically part of the entertainment. You had memorable fast food commercials, cereal commercials, soda commercials, toys, video games, and some of those commercials had better soundtracks than actual television shows. You'd see an ad for some new toy and immediately start begging your parents for it. Mom, I need this. You don't need that. Yes, I do. You already have one. But this one does something different, something new. Every kid listening knows exactly what I'm talking about. Then there were Saturday mornings. And Saturday morning television was sacred. You'd wake up, grab a bowl of cereal, turn on the television, and spend hours watching cartoons. Batman the Animated Series, X-Men, my favorite, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Power Rangers, Doug, Rugrats, Beavis and Butthead, whatever your thing was, Saturday morning was yours. And nobody could tell you to get off your phone because you didn't have one. Nobody could tell you to stop scrolling TikTok because TikTok didn't exist. Nobody could text you because texting wasn't even a thing at that point. You just sat there and watched television. And honestly, I think that's part of why we remember it so fondly. There weren't 1,000 other things competing for our attention. You watched the show. And you watched the show. That's it. And if somebody called the house while you were watching it, you had a decision to make. Do I answer the phone or do I risk missing something? And if you were really unlucky, your parents picked up. Chris, phone! And you're sitting there thinking, why are you interrupting my life? Today you can pause a show, you can rewind it, you can watch it tomorrow. You can watch the entire season in one weekend. Back then you had one shot, and somehow that made it more memorable. Maybe that's why I can still remember theme songs from shows I haven't watched in 25 years. But I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday. That's the weird thing about nostalgia. It's not necessarily that everything was better. It's that we were younger. We had fewer responsibilities. We weren't constantly connected to everyone. And television was one of the things that brought us together. You could walk into school and know that half the people had watched the same show you did. You could argue about who was better, who was funnier, who should end up with whom. And if you were a teenage guy, you could spend an entire conversation discussing your celebrity crush like you had a legitimate chance of meeting her. And for me, obviously that was Topanga. I'm standing by it. She was the 90s crush. No regrets. Well, maybe one. Probably should have spent a little less time watching Boy Meets World and a little more time figuring out how to actually talk to women. But that's a story for another episode. And that's what made the 90s television so damn special. It wasn't just something you watched. It was something you experienced. You waited for it. You talked about it. You shared it. And when the episode ended, you had to wait until next week. No autoplay, no next episode countdown. Just see you next week. And somehow, we survived that too. All right, let's talk about movies. No, I'm not going to spend 20 minutes talking about the movie theater experience because honestly, it's really not that different today. You still walk into the theater, you buy a popcorn that somehow costs more than the movie ticket, get a drink that's approximately the size of a small aquarium, and wonder why you just spent $40 on snacks. So some things apparently never change. But what has changed is everything that happened around movies. Because in the 90s, if you wanted to watch a movie at home, you actually had to go get the damn movie. And that meant Blockbuster. If you grew up in the 90s and you knew exactly what I'm talking about, Friday night, pile into the car, maybe grab some food, head over to Blockbuster. And then you'd walk around for what seemed like eternity trying to decide what movie to rent. And here's the funny thing. You had no idea what you were going to watch when you walked in. You just knew you wanted a movie. So you'd wander around, look at the covers, read the descriptions, pick something up, put it back. Pick it up again, then you'd see something else. And eventually you'd find the perfect movie, except it's gone. Every copy is rented. So now you're standing there holding your second choice thinking, well, I guess we're watching this. And somehow that movie would end up being great or absolutely terrible. There was no real middle ground. And there was no Rotten Tomatoes sitting in your pocket telling you whether the movie was worth watching. You had a VHS case, a 2-sentence description, and maybe the opinion of the guy working behind the counter. That was your movie review. And sometimes that guy had no idea what he or she was talking about. But you trusted them anyway. Then you'd finally get home, pop the VHS in the VCR, and you'd hear that familiar clunk. And there it was, your movie. But before you could actually watch it, you had to deal with the greatest technological advancement of the 90s, the rewind button, because somebody, and you know who you are, returned the movie without rewinding it. And Blockbuster had one simple rule: be kind, rewind. And if you didn't, you were basically a criminal. I swear there was a special kind of rage that came from putting in a movie, hitting play, and seeing the tape start at the end. Now you've got to sit there listening to the VCR make that horrible mechanical noise for 5 minutes while it rewinds. And you're just staring there thinking, who raised you? VHS was a commitment. Because VHS tapes were huge. Not just physically. You could rent a movie and the damn thing looked like a brick. And if you owned movies, you had shelves full of them. You knew exactly where your favorites were. You'd have your comedy section, your action movies, your horror movies, and then that one VHS that you weren't supposed to have because your parents didn't want you watching it. And speaking of parents, let's talk about recording things. Because if you had a VCR with a blank VHS tape, you had a television recording studio. You could record your favorite TV show or your favorite movie. You could record music videos off of MTV, and then you'd label the tape with a Sharpie. Something incredibly sophisticated like movies or MTV stuff. And 6 months later, you'd have absolutely no idea what was on it. So you'd put it in, hit play, and discover that your dad had recorded the evening news over your favorite movie. Thanks, Dad. Really appreciate that. And then came along DVDs. And we thought, this is it. We've reached the pinnacle. This is the future. No more rewinding, better picture, better sound, menus, special features. You could skip chapters. We were amazed. And then somebody figured out you could scratch the disc, and suddenly your $25 DVD was worthless. But even DVDs changed the way we consumed movies, because now you could own an entire movie collection without needing a piece of furniture specifically designed to hold giant VHS tapes. And then, eventually, streaming happened and everything changed. Now I can sit on my couch and have access to more movies than I could have imagined as a teenager, which is amazing. But there's also something weird about it, because now I can spend 30 minutes scrolling through Netflix, then another 30 minutes scrolling through Hulu, then another 20 minutes scrolling through Amazon, and eventually decide, you know what? I don't feel like watching anything. Back then, you had 5 options. You'd pick one. You watched it. The end. And man, what a decade for movies. The 90s gave us some absolute masterpieces. I'm talking like Jurassic Park, Terminator 2, The Matrix, Independence Day, Titanic, The Sandlot, Clueless, Scream, Wayne's World, Ace Ventura, Dumb and Dumber, Happy Gilmore, Billy Madison, American Pie, The Big Lebowski, Fight Club. And that's just scratching the surface. Because what's crazy is that those movies weren't just movies. They became part of culture. We quoted them. We dressed like the characters. We repeated jokes from them at school. We argued about them with our friends. And some of those movies, you could practically memorize the entire damn thing. Dumb and Dumber comes to mind. You didn't watch that movie. You quoted that movie. Same with Happy Gilmore. Somebody says, "Are you too good for your home?" And immediately someone else knows exactly where that came from. That's what made the 90s movies different. They became shared experiences. Everybody had seen them, or at least everybody knew somebody who had. And that's probably why certain movies still hit differently when I see them today. Because I don't just remember the movie, I remember where I was when I saw it. I remember who I was with. I remember what life was like. I remember being a teenager, sitting in a theater, or sitting on the floor in front of the television watching a VHS, and having absolutely no idea that 25 or 30 years later, I'd be sitting here talking about it on a podcast. That's the weird thing about nostalgia. You don't realize you're making memories while you're making them. You just think you're watching a movie. You're just hanging out with friends. You're just renting something from Blockbuster. You're just sitting in your parents' living room. Then suddenly you're 45 years old and you're talking about it like it happened yesterday. And maybe that's why I don't actually miss VHS. I don't miss rewinding tapes, and I definitely don't miss the late fees. And I sure as hell don't miss paying for a movie and discovering somebody recorded over it. What I miss is the feeling, the anticipation, having a Friday night planned around one movie, walking into Blockbuster and not knowing what you were going to leave with, finding something completely random and having it become one of your favorite movies. Today, we have almost unlimited choices. Back then, our choices were limited, but somehow we made those choices matter. And I think that's one of the biggest differences between then and now. We didn't have everything, so the things we did have sometimes meant a whole lot more. Which brings us to another thing that we had in the 90s that we definitely don't experience the same way anymore. Music. If there's one thing I think the 90s absolutely got right, it was music. And I'm not just talking about the music itself. I'm talking about how we discovered it. Because today, you open Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or whatever service you're using, and within 30 seconds, an algorithm has already decided what kind of music you should like. You listen to one Green Day song and suddenly you're like, hey, Chris, here's 47 bands you might enjoy. And honestly, that's pretty damn convenient. But we didn't have that. If you wanted to discover music in the 90s, you had to find that shit yourself. And one of the biggest ways you did that was MTV. And I'm talking about real MTV. Back when MTV actually played music videos. I know, crazy concept. You'd turn on the television and there would be music. Not Jersey Shore, not Teen Mom, not whatever reality show they were running that week. Music. You'd have VJs introducing videos. You'd see a new band you'd never heard of. And sometimes you'd watch a video and think, holy shit, who is this? And now you had to remember the name of the band because you couldn't just pull out your phone and search the song. You had to either remember it or hope they played it again. And if you really liked it, you waited for it to come back on. One of the biggest things was Total Request Live. TRL was basically appointment television for teenagers. You'd sit there watching Carson Daly count down the videos, and everybody had their favorite. You wanted your favorite band to make it to number one, and if they did, that was a legitimate victory. You didn't have Spotify showing you how many times you had listened to a song. You had MTV telling you your band is number one, and that mattered. Then there was radio. Radio was huge. You'd hear a song you like, and then you'd sit there waiting for the DJ to tell you who the hell it was, because sometimes they'd wait until the end. And you're sitting there thinking, who was that? And if you were lucky, they'd announce it. Then you'd grab a cassette tape, and this was important. You put that cassette into your boombox, hit record, and wait. You had to time it perfectly, because if the DJ started talking over the beginning of the song, you were pissed. You'd have this beautiful recording of your favorite song, and then right over the opening, and that was the new hit single from Shut Up. I'm recording this. You ruined it. And if you were really dedicated, you'd make a mixtape. Now, a mixtape wasn't just a bunch of songs thrown together. There was thought involved. You had to decide what songs went on it, what order they went in, what song started the tape, what song ended it. You wanted the transitions to be perfect. You wanted the whole thing to have a vibe. And if you were making one for somebody you liked, that was serious business. You were basically saying, here are 3 hours of my emotional personality. And if they actually listened to the whole thing, that was basically a relationship. Buying music was a gamble back then. CDs weren't cheap. You'd walk into the music store with 15 or 20 bucks, and you'd better know what you were buying because there was no Spotify. You couldn't listen to the entire album for free. You couldn't pull it up on YouTube. You couldn't sample every song. Sometimes you bought an album because you heard one song on the radio, and you thought, this band is awesome. So you bought the CD. You get home, put it in. Track 1, awesome. Track 2, pretty good. Track 3, okay. Track 4, what the hell is this? Track 5, oh, come on. And suddenly you just spent $15 on one good song. But sometimes you got lucky. Sometimes you bought an album and practically every song was great. And that's one thing I miss. We used to listen to albums, not just individual songs. You'd put the CD in, start at track 1, and listen. You learned the order. You knew which song was coming next. You knew which tracks you were going to skip. You had your favorite song. You had the song that grew on you, and sometimes the song you didn't like at first eventually became your favorite. Now we have playlists with 700 songs in them. And half the time, I don't even know what I'm listening to. We used to have albums. Now we have an endless stream of individual songs. And I'm not saying one is better, it's just different. And what I really loved about the 90s was the variety. You could listen to almost anything. You had grunge, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains. Then pop punk shows up like Green Day, The Offspring, Blink-182 later on. You had alternative rock, Weezer, Third Eye Blind, Bush, and then you had ska, No Doubt, Sublime. You had hip hop, Tupac, Biggie, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg. You had pop like Britney Spears, Backstreet Boys, and NSYNC. And then you had the beginning of what would become nu metal. That would be like Korn, Limp Bizkit, Deftones, and somehow all of this existed at the same time. And nobody seemed to care that you liked more than one genre. You could listen to Green Day, then put on Tupac, then listen to some country, and then turn around and listen to Metallica. Nobody was checking your Spotify profile thinking, wait a minute, Chris listened to Shania Twain. I don't know if I can be friends with him anymore. You just listen to what you like. Now, obviously, if we're talking about music in the 90s, I can't not talk about Green Day because for me, that was the band. Green Day was my favorite pop punk band of the 90s. And I've talked about them before in the podcast, so I won't go through the entire history again because we already did that in episode 3. But Green Day was one of those bands that wasn't just music to me. They were part of growing up. Dookie came out when I was a teenager, and it was one of those albums that just hit. Then came Insomniac, then Nimrod, and you could hear the band changing. They weren't just repeating the same album over and over. They were growing, and I was growing with them, which is probably why I still listen to them sometimes today. And if you've been listening to the show for a while, you know I eventually took that fandom to another level, got a Green Day tattoo back in 2011, which is kind of funny when you think about it. Most people grow out of the music they loved as teenagers, and I apparently decided, nope, I'm going to permanently put this shit on my body. And you know what? I don't regret it yet, because that music represents a part of my life. And that's what tattoos do for me. They're timestamps. That one reminds me of being young, being a teenager, being completely obsessed with the band, and feeling like their music understood something about me that I couldn't necessarily put into words. And speaking of being obsessed with Green Day, apparently liking them wasn't enough for teenage Chris. In my senior year of high school, I wrote that research paper about them. Thinking about that, my teacher basically said, pick a topic and write a research paper. And teenage me thought, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to spend my senior year researching Green Day. So I looked into how they formed, their early days, how they came out of the punk scene, how Dookie exploded into the mainstream, and the impact that they had on 90s music and the culture. At the time, I thought I was just writing a paper about my favorite band. Looking back, it's kind of funny because here I am decades later still talking about them, still listening to them, not quite as much. I was still wearing my tattoo. Apparently teenage Chris knew something adult Chris didn't. And I think that's what I miss most about music from that era. It felt personal. You found a band, you found an album, you heard a song at exactly the right moment in your life, and suddenly that song belonged to you. You associated it with a girlfriend, a summer, a road trip, your friends, high school, college, a breakup, party, stupid decision, whatever it was, the music became attached to the memory. And years later, you hear that song again, and you're right back there. For me, that's what Green Day does. I can hear a song I've heard 1,000 times, and I'm suddenly 16 or 17 again. And I think that's something algorithms can't recreate. An algorithm can recommend a song you might like, but it can't tell you, this song is going to become a part of your life. You have to discover that yourself. And that's what we did. We found music through friends, through radio, MTV, CDs, concerts, through word of mouth. Somebody said, hey, dude, have you listened to this band? And then you'd borrow their CD and maybe never give it back. Sorry, Brian, still have it. We didn't have every song ever recorded sitting in our pocket. We had to go looking. And maybe that's why music felt more important. You had to put some effort into finding it. You had to spend money on it. You had to listen to it. You had to decide if you liked it. And when you found something that really connected with you, it stuck. So yeah, I love the convenience of Spotify. I love being able to listen to almost anything I want whenever I want. But there's something I'll always miss about the 90s. We didn't have an algorithm telling us what we'd like. We had our friends. We had the radio. We had MTV, music stores, mixtapes. And sometimes we just saw an album cover that looked cool and thought, fuck it, I'm buying it. Sometimes you got burned. Sometimes you found your new favorite band. And sometimes you found music that would stay with you for the rest of your life. And I think that's one of the things that makes the 90s music so damn special. We didn't just consume it, we went looking for it. And when we found it, we made it part of who we were. Which brings us to another thing that was pretty damn big part of being a teenager in the 90s, the mall. So this week I want to talk about something that connects pretty much everything we've talked about tonight, the internet. More specifically, what the internet remembers about you. Because here's something I don't think people fully understand. When you put something online, you don't necessarily get to take it back. And that's what we call your digital footprint. Now, don't let the cybersecurity term scare you. It's actually pretty simple. Think about walking through wet cement. Every step you take leaves a footprint. You keep walking, and eventually you've left a trail behind you. And that's basically what you do online. Every time you create an account, post something, comment on something, like something, send an email, buy something, or even just browse certain websites, you're potentially leaving pieces of information behind. And here's where I get concerned, because people treat the internet like it's a conversation in a bar. They think, oh, I'll just delete it later. No, maybe not. You post a picture, somebody screenshots it. You delete the original. Their screenshot still exists. You make a stupid comment. Somebody shares it. You delete the comment. Now it's somewhere else. You send somebody a private message. You think it's private. They screenshot it, and now it's not. And this is especially important for younger people, because when you're 16, you don't necessarily think about what something you posted today could look like when you're 25 or 35 or applying for a job. You're thinking, this is funny, and maybe it is. But the internet doesn't know you're 16. It just knows the information exists. And that's where cybersecurity comes in, because protecting yourself online isn't just about some mysterious hacker sitting in a dark room trying to steal your identity. Sometimes it's about something much more basic, controlling what information you give away. And let's say you post a picture from a vacation. Awesome. Had a great time. But maybe you also just told the entire internet, hey, I'm not home. You post a picture of your new house. Congratulations. But now you've potentially shown people where you live. You post a picture of your driver's license because you're excited you finally got it. Please don't. You've just put information out there that somebody else could potentially use. And here's another one. Passwords. Please stop using the same password for everything. I know it's convenient. I know it's easier. But if your password for some random website that you've forgotten gets stolen, and that same password is what you use for your email, your bank, your social media, especially your work, now you've got a problem. That's why I always tell people, use different passwords. And if you can, use a password manager, turn on multi-factor authentication, and don't click random shit somebody sends you. It's not complicated cybersecurity, it's just common sense. And here's something else people need to understand. Cybersecurity isn't just about protecting your computer, it's about protecting you, your identity, your money, your reputation, your personal information, and sometimes your future, because the internet has a really long memory. And I think that's one of the biggest differences between growing up in the 90s and growing up today. When I was a teenager, I could do something incredibly stupid, and eventually people forgot. There wasn't a camera in everybody's pocket. There wasn't social media documenting everything. There wasn't a permanent digital record of every stupid thing I said when I was 17. And thank God, because if there was, I'd probably have to change my name and maybe move to another country. But kids today don't necessarily get that luxury. And honestly, neither do adults. So before you post something, before you send something, before you put something online, take about 5 seconds and ask yourself, would I be okay with this being public 5 years from now? And if the answer is no, maybe don't post it. And that's my Ginger Grievance for this week. Not that technology exists, not that the internet exists. Hell, I make a podcast on the internet. Clearly, I'm part of the problem. My grievance is that we've gotten so used to sharing everything that sometimes we forget the internet doesn't forget nearly as easily as we do. So protect yourself. Think before you post. Use good passwords. Turn on multi-factor authentication. And remember, if you wouldn't stand in the middle of the mall and yell it through a megaphone, maybe don't put it on Facebook either. Because that's a digital footprint that you're creating. You're the one who's leaving it behind.
Well, I think we've officially spent enough time living in the 90s for one more night. We've talked about television, movies, music, the mall, the internet, and apparently I've managed to prove that I was a teenager during one of the most ridiculous decades in modern history, and honestly, I'm glad I was. Because the more I think about it, I don't actually miss the technology. I don't miss dial-up. I don't miss rewinding VHS tapes. I don't miss having to get off the internet because somebody needed to use the phone. I don't miss waiting for a song to come on the radio so I could record it onto a cassette. And I definitely don't miss paying $12 for a CD just to discover the one song I liked was the only good song on the album. But I miss what all of that technology forced us to do. We had to wait. We actually had to go places. We had to talk to people. We had to make plans. We had to remember phone numbers. We had to sit through commercials. We had to watch a television show when it was actually on. We had to go to Blockbuster if we wanted a movie. We had to go to the mall if we wanted to see our friends. And if we wanted to discover new music, we had to actually go looking for it. There was something kind of special about that. And I think that's why people my age get so nostalgic about the 90s. It's not necessarily because everything was better. It absolutely wasn't. We had plenty of problems. We just didn't have the smartphone documenting them all. We were not constantly connected. And because we weren't constantly connected, sometimes we were actually present. We could go somewhere and nobody knew where we were. We could make a stupid decision and there wasn't a camera pointed at us. We could have an embarrassing conversation and it didn't end up on TikTok. We could screw up, learn from it, and eventually people forgot. Now, everything has a screenshot. Everything has a camera. Everything has a digital footprint. And that's probably the biggest lesson I took away from this episode. Technology isn't the enemy. Hell, my entire career exists because of technology, and here I am sitting in front of a microphone talking to people that I've never met, using the internet about the fucking 90s. And that's pretty incredible when you think about it. The same kid who was sitting in a South Dakota high school in 96, messing around with the computers, had absolutely no idea what the world was going to look like 30 years later. I certainly didn't know that I'd end up working in cybersecurity. I didn't know that I'd start a podcast. And I sure as hell didn't know that I'd eventually be sitting here reminiscing about Topanga. But here we are. And maybe that's what I love most about looking back. You don't realize you're living through an important period while you're actually living it. You're just living. You're going to school, hanging out with friends, listening to music, watching TV, going to the mall, falling in love, getting your heart broken, making stupid decisions, making good decisions, growing up, and then one day you look back and realize those were the good old days. Not because everything was perfect, but because you were there. And if you're listening to this and you grew up in the 90s, I want you to think about one thing. What is the one thing from that decade that you would bring back? A TV show, a band, a video game, a restaurant, a piece of technology, a place, a person. Maybe it's something completely ridiculous. Maybe it's something you haven't thought about in 20 years. Send it to me because apparently I haven't gotten my fill of the 90s yet, and I'm sure there's going to be more. Who knows? Maybe we'll definitely do this again. Because there's still a hell of a lot we haven't talked about. And if you're younger and you're listening to this thinking those old people are really obsessed with the 90s, you're probably right. But give it 30 years. You'll understand. You'll be sitting somewhere in 2056 complaining about how everything used to be, and some teenager will look at you like you're an idiot, and you'll say you wouldn't understand, because that's what every generation does. We look backward. We remember the things that made us happy, and we wonder where the hell the time went. So thank you for taking this little trip back with me, and thank you for sticking around while I've been trying to juggle this podcast with moving and everything else life has decided to throw at me. I'm getting back on track, I promise. And if you've enjoyed the show, do me a favor, follow the podcast. Share it with somebody who grew up in the 90s. Send me your stories, send me your questions, and if you want to support the show, head over to angrygingerpodcast.com and check out the merch. Rep the chaos, because apparently that's what we do now. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Don't post anything online that you're going to regret in 10 years. Don't trust a guy named XX underscore Dark Angel 420 underscore XX in a chat room. And if you're ever feeling nostalgic, put on some Green Day, find an old 90s movie, and remember what it felt like when the biggest problem you had was somebody picking up the phone and knocking you off the internet. I'm Chris. This is the Angry Ginger Podcast. True stories, bad decisions, good laughs, and I will see you next time.